Hello, this is Mr. Ferreira, and I'm going to be talking through the second part of my Introduction to Addiction course. Specifically today we look at defining addiction and taking a lot of the material from a book called The Biology of Desire by Mark Lewis. He is a former addict and he is writing from experience, and also there's a number of case studies in his book that are really interesting. However, can't lend this book to you because I bought it on the Kindle. Now, we saw from the previous lesson that addiction is more than what we mostly have thought of before. It's different from use. We may try alcohol, we may even try recreational drugs, but in order for us to be defined as an addict, there's often a number of components that we need to have a look at. The second part of our understanding of Introduction to Addiction is for us to see that we can use different models, different approaches to try and understand the nature of addiction. Now, in this particular book, as I said, Mr. Lewis is trying to, or Dr. Lewis is trying to get us to see beyond the disease model. So firstly, what we can say is that it's really important that we do move away from this concept that an addict is somebody who has some kind of moral deficit or personal fall from grace. Okay, so this is this idea that it was a bad person that became an addict. He then takes us through three categories. Now, there's a lot more to each of these categories. I'll try and explain each of them individually. The first one being the disease model, choice model, and then the self-medication model. Now, firstly, in the disease model, what we have here is that there's something specific about the brain. In other words, when we participate in addictive behavior, and of course this is very clearly seen in taking an addictive substance, we saw this in the video previously, that this can affect the brain or the body very, very quickly. Now, the key to this is this concept of reward. Okay? So the addict takes the particular substance in order to be rewarded in some way. Obviously, I would hope that by now you can see that reward can be things like the absence of, so something like absence of pain. So if I am particularly miserable or vulnerable or feeling in a particular way, then of course I might be able to take a drug that makes me not think about those things. Or obviously some of you might be familiar with this idea of being tipsy or kind of having the high sensation of a drug. That's a reward as well. Now, according to the disease model, Mr. Lewis, Dr. Lewis says that what this focuses on is the changes. Okay, so in other words, as one repeatedly starts taking a drug, okay, we have this idea that your body is permanently changed. Okay, so we see here it's impossible to reverse. Okay, so we know from scans, we know from looking at brain structures of addicts that it's likely to affect the reward center, the nuclear accumbens of the brain. In contrast, we have the second model that he wants us to have a look at, and this is, instead of it being biological or about the pharmacological effect on our bodies, it's about choice. And so therefore, if we talk about choice, we have to talk about cognitive. Now, in the disease model, because there's a permanent change in our brain, you could argue that we are always addicted. So we look at organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous, and they'll kind of use the phrase that once you are an alcoholic, you always are an alcoholic. Okay, so what this is that you can't kind of be free from your addiction. Okay, and we can see potentially why this could be problematic. Now, for some people, this could be a good idea, because then they can say, yes, I have this disease, I couldn't do it, so therefore don't blame me for the things that I've done. And you might choose something like abstinence in order to stop taking the particular drug. Okay. Now, when we move to the choice model, we see here that it's our thinking. Okay, so it's no longer biological, and so therefore we look at things like perspective, okay, and how our thoughts may change over time. Okay, so our thoughts processes may change over time. Now, hopefully some of you are at least thinking, well, how or why would somebody choose to take a drug that's debilitating? Now, of course, this goes back down to the circumstances. Using the example I used before, I may actually feel absolutely miserable. My life may have lots of problems in it, and so therefore choosing something to take those problems away actually is quite a logical process. Okay, so that's what this whole slide is about, saying that it's not necessarily about a good choice, okay? It's about a rational choice, okay? So for example, if I want to forget my troubles and I know that if I drink to excess, I pass out, I can't remember what I'm doing, and of course that's quite a rational choice. We also see this idea that it could fit into this whole idea of kind of short term, and we see this idea of outweighing other possible choices. So in other words, I could obviously deal with the pain in my life, I could try and work through some of my issues, but you know what, it's easier to take a pill, and so therefore it feeds into this idea of immediate gratification. The choice model in this particular case then is seen as being something better than the disease model. The disease model often will have issues with, well, why do I start taking something, and things like that, where this one is about looking at the circumstances, looking at what is rational to me, and ultimately I then choose to do it that particular way. Now, the final model that we look at in terms of this particular introduction is the self-medication model. Now, in the course, we will have a look at kind of the learning approach to addiction. This is slightly different to the models that I'm talking about today, but we can see that it's important for us to have a look at current kind of ideas and thoughts as well. So self-medication, in my understanding, is quite similar to this idea of choice, okay? But it does actually try and marry together this idea of medicine and choice. Okay, so it says here, it derives from psychology and from medicine and from sociology. Okay, but let's have a look at it. It says, now as we develop, we have potential issues that we can and do have to deal with. Okay, I suspect that many of you are kind of quite comfortable with this idea that life in itself can cause emotional problems. Okay, now of course, if this gets a bit overwhelming, it says here it can erode our sense of well-being. So what we try and do is to find something to deal with these problems. Now, of course, that's something in psychology we often call strategies. Okay, so for many of us during the lockdown, we might then go, okay, I'm feeling slightly bored, okay, and I'm tired of watching Netflix, so you might go out for a walk. Okay, now this might be something completely foreign to many of you, this idea that you voluntarily get out of the house. Okay, but that's because we have different emotional problems. We also have different things that would erode our sense of well-being. Okay, so what I could do is I could turn to strategies that help me to deal with those problems. See, there's an element of rational thought processes there as well. So another way to look at this, many of you have potentially had a headache. And then if you ask yourself, well, what do I do when I have a headache? Now, not all of you immediately turn to the paracetamol. Okay, some of you might have a bit of a lie down. Some of you might put on some calming music, or actually might even go for a walk. Okay, so we all have different strategies that potentially help us deal with the problem of having a headache. Okay, now the key to the strategy is that it doesn't have to work, it's I have to think it works. Okay, so what we find here is somebody who thinks that taking a paracetamol will help their headache is more inclined to take paracetamol. So then we look at this particular side and we see that those particular substance abuse people, many of them have post-traumatic stress disorder. In other words, they have turned to something like alcohol, gambling, drugs, sex, whatever it is that is the addictive behavior, in order to help them deal with the traumatic experience. Okay? So we also know in relation to this is we're going to see very importantly that drug use is often related to stress relief. Okay, and this will become one of the risk factors that we'll look at later on. Now, of course, each model in themselves can have implications. So, for example, it is going to be convenient for us to have a disease model. So therefore funding or kind of research or any of those types of things could be quite easy. We can have drug addicts and we can give them methadone in order to help their heroin addiction. Okay, or we could have something where we potentially can either withdraw funding or add funding to somebody who's an addict because of our model. Okay, now the two that obviously society may struggle with would be choice, because why would we help somebody who has a choice? And we have something called this war on drugs. Okay, so therefore there's an implication, war on drugs. So therefore, people who take drugs, people who deal drugs, people who kind of own the drug industry, we need to fight them because they've made some bad choices in their lives. Okay? And we also could have something like the disease model. And the implication, as I said, the treatment is easy. We give, quite ironically, a drug addict another drug to overcome their drug. It's harder for society to turn to things like a choice and self-medication and for us to kind of be sympathetic of those people who do take drugs. Okay, now this is just an example of the different implications of the choice model, for example, saying we need to change your perspective. I think I have another one here as well, self-medication model, the need to protect children. So in other words, we need to maybe make sure that young people are educated at school to make the right type of choices and things like that. I think after the lockdown, I think there'll be a lot of educational questions asked about kind of have we prepared children for these circumstances, how did we help them cope and things like that. So we see that every model that we have within psychology has potential implications for the future. Now, this has just been a brief kind of summary of the book. I do hope that some of you do choose to read it. It's actually really good. And what we find is that each of these models in some ways do kind of help us understand addicts, but none of the particular models are seen as being complete. Because the key issue that the book addresses is that we don't seem to be asking the right type of questions. And Dr. Lewis kind of outlined some kind of key questions. So first of all, kind of what is addiction? Now that's kind of what we've been trying to deal with. Can we look at this idea of what makes a person addicted? The more I teach this course, the more I seem to realize that addiction is not so much about a substance, it's about kind of something else. So therefore, the how does it work is really important. And then the last one is that addiction has been around for such a long time. Why is it difficult to stop? For example, if it was the disease model, it would be very simple. We'd find some kind of treatments that would be effective and would be effective for everyone because we'd have some kind of solution. But it's not. In fact, one treatment may work for one person and not for the other. And as we come to the end of the course, we will look at Russell Brand, who has gone on to kind of be quite vocal about this idea that the war on drugs doesn't work, and also how we view addicts is not working as well. So in order to end this, I want you to go into the addiction part of the Google Drive, you should find a video that says everything we think we know. Ultimately, it's a video that says everything that we thought we knew about drugs, we are wrong, and that we need to rethink things. Now, the first bit is very good and very interesting, and it gives quite good examples of how some of the initial research into drug addiction was flawed, kind of focusing on rats in a cage, this idea that if you put a rat in the cage, it become addicted to a substance. Near the end, it kind of looks at kind of different circumstances, but I have to apologize in advance. The kind of last 30 seconds or so of the video are kind of more about this kind of mental approach and kind of buying into a particular system. But what it ultimately says about addiction is really important for you to have a listen to. I'm probably going to set a question on this as well. I hope that you have found this interesting. It's perhaps not the best recording I've done, but I'm still kind of learning how to use the software. Have a good day and see you soon.